Hello! In this lesson we are going to look at relativism, both moral relativism and what's known as evidential relativism. So what exactly is relativism? Well, in moral philosophy terms, in metaethical terms, it is the idea that all moral judgments are relative to one another. In other words, you just have a series of different moral systems or moral codes spread across the world. Each one is relative to the next. All right. So any subjective conception of moral judgments is a relativistic one. Okay, since our moral standards vary according to either the attitude of the individual or the attitude of society. All right. So if, for example, we have 20 people in the room, each of whom has a different moral outlook, we can just say that each of their moral codes is relative. Okay, there's no absolute moral truth. What we're talking about is relativism. Okay, and the same can be said in relation to the many different societies that there are in the world. So relativism can be contrasted with what is known as moral absolutism. Okay. And moral absolutism is the idea that morality is objective, fixed, and unchanging. In other words, there are moral facts. And as you will see in videos on moral realism, Plato could be considered as a moral absolutist, as could Immanuel Kant, although for very different reasons. So whatever cultural context you happen to be in, if you are a moral absolutist, there are certain fixed moral truths. And it might be, for example, that a culture possesses none of these moral truths and that they're entirely morally ignorant. Okay, that is one potential consequence of being a moral absolutist. But let's now return to relativism. And firstly, let's look at what is known as descriptive relativism. As we've seen already, moral codes differ from one society to the next. In fact, they differ on an individual level. Some people or some societies believe that slavery is morally permissible. In other words, it's morally okay. Some don't. Some enforce female circumcision. Some don't. And some hold that everyone should be treated as equals, and some don't. Okay. So, for example, in the UK, there is much emphasis put on equality between men and women, for example, whereas in Saudi Arabia it has only recently become the case that women have been allowed to drive, and women have far fewer rights as citizens in Saudi Arabia than men. So descriptive relativism is essentially factual. It is a fact that there are different moral codes throughout the world. All right. There is nothing moral about making a factual claim. So there's nothing moral about me observing that slavery is morally permissible in some cultures, but not in others. Okay? It's just a fact. It's a true statement about how things are in the world. However, descriptive relativism can be contrasted with moral relativism. Now, moral relativism states there is no objective moral standard independent of what societies believe or what societies endorse. Okay? There is no objective moral truth for all people at all times. So again, you can see that relativism is the opposite of absolutism. But saying there is no objective moral truth is not actually a factual claim. All right? And we can see this from other irrealist arguments such as emotivism, prescriptivism, and Mackey's argument from queerness and error theory. All right? So what are the implications of relativism? Well, relativism does not imply tolerance, as is sometimes believed. The idea that relativism does imply tolerance is in fact incoherent. So a moral relativist will say there are no objective moral truths, so you ought to respect other moral systems or other moralities. But this doesn't make any sense, because the conclusion at 2, you ought to respect other moralities, states what is supposed to be an objective moral truth. But if there are no objective moral truths, how can this be the case? And what if my society's moral code recommends intolerance? There are, of course, forms of what is known as relativistic realism. All right, and relativistic realism can be characterized essentially by the idea that we can have a series of rules within a culture to which we can appeal to say whether something is right or wrong. Okay, so we create the rules and create a sort of framework within which we have a moral code. All right, but that doesn't mean that that moral code or that moral framework is actually factual. Okay, it's still irrealist, it's still subjective, but we have invented a framework which, for example, makes it easier to get along with other people in that culture. All right. So although there's no absolute truth, moral judgments can be viewed as true or false in accordance with the social expectations of a particular culture. So they can be viewed as true or false within that framework, but they're not actually factually true or false. All right. So this view is known as relativistic realism. Now, many people think that this is a much more plausible argument than the idea of moral absolutism. Okay, largely because of the evidence that there is. Right, there doesn't seem to be a good reason for preferring one culture to another beyond the fact that one prefers one's own set of moral ideas. All right, so we might find certain moral ideas of different cultures abhorrent, but there's nothing objective that seems to suggest that there is one moral truth to which everyone should stick to. All right. So think about another way of looking at this would be think about how much moral views change from place to place and from era to era. Okay, slavery was morally acceptable in the ancient Greek times, but is considered morally abhorrent in today's Western societies. And in fact, in ancient Greek times, having a slave or two wasn't even considered to be a moral issue. It wasn't like, oh, I've got a couple of slaves. I can see there's some moral doubt about this, but it's okay because society accepts it. It wasn't like that. You know, owning a slave was largely, the same as owning a TV. Nobody really thought about the moral implications at all because they didn't see that there were any. All right. Similarly, in Britain, we believe in democracy, but some other cultures do not. For example, in the Middle East, and indeed in one country in the world, Bhutan, the people actually voted for an absolute ruler. Okay, and who is to say really which society's values are right or wrong? We believe our own are right because they are the ones that we prefer, but there's no evidence to suggest that we are factually more accurate than anyone else. So how do we evaluate relativism? Well, it does seem like a particularly attractive option because it allows for a certain measure of objectivity within the framework that we have developed. All right, and it generally suggests that we should accept the values of another culture even if we don't fully understand them. All right, so implicitly at least it tries to dissolve the likelihood of conflict between cultures. All right, this is moral relativism, of course, we're talking about, not evidential relativism. Okay, now of course you might disagree with that, and you might, for example, argue that relativism doesn't suggest that we should accept the values of another culture, as per the argument that I made earlier. All right, but it's quite a common idea that people think that because all morality is relative, then we should try and tolerate one another. All right? But there are good reasons to think that might not be the case. There is perhaps a further question mark, though, to be put over relativism, and that is the thought that it is inconsistent. So, whilst the moral relativist claims that judgments are fundamentally relative, they're also arguing that the theory of moral relativism is true. Now, if it's true, it's not relative. Okay? So, there seems to be a question mark to be raised there as well. And then, of course, there are questions about relativism and multiculturalism. Does a multicultural society count as one culture? All right? Or does it count as a series of smaller cultures that are able to coexist? All right? In other words, could we say genuinely that British society is one multicultural society, or is it really just a conglomeration of very small cultures that happen to have the ability, most of the time at least, to get on with each other? All right. So consider that some dimensions of a multicultural society believe in accepting beliefs that are different to their own, and that others do not. Okay. You can, of course, within what is known as a tolerant society, pick out those aspects of that multicultural society that are perhaps less keen on accepting the beliefs of others, and some other aspects that are very keen on accepting all of the beliefs, even those that are perhaps intolerant of other beliefs. Okay? And would the relativist be forced to separate these various dimensions into subcultures? And where do you draw the lines? Okay? When do you cut off one culture from another? Where do you sort of make that dividing line? And all of that rather seems dependent on your own value system. Okay? How you see these various different cultures. All right? Are they one culture? Are they several cultures? Or are they a really high number of very small cultures? Okay, so even within a particular religion, you have divisions. So, for example, you've got Catholicism and the Anglican Church and various other forms of Protestantism within Christianity. You have, for example, Shia and Sunni Islam, and other smaller, if you like, denominations as well. And where do you draw the line? Do you just say do we just talk about Christians? Do we just talk about Islam? Or do we talk about the various divisions within each? All right. So again, relativism does seem to face some of these problems when it comes to talking about multiculturalism. Okay, and what are the consequences of making these divisions? All right. And so, if we choose to accept all views within a multiculturalist society, we take away the possibility of moral criticism within that multicultural society because everything is accepted. All right. So there are certain problems that relativism does have, and these are worth thinking about if you are writing about it in an essay. All right. So just to summarise, relativism is the idea that all moral judgments are relative to one another and that there are no moral facts. There is what is known as descriptive relativism, which is just the observation that there are many different moral systems in the world, but that observation, whilst that observation is a fact, it's got nothing really to do with morality itself. All it is doing is observing that there are many different ways in which people believe they are acting morally throughout the world. Okay, you can contrast descriptive relativism with moral relativism, which is the belief that all morality is just relative to the next person's, and that as such there are no moral facts. But what you can't do is reason from the fact that there are many different moral systems to the thought that because that is so, we should therefore tolerate all of them. All right? Because from that you're saying all morality is relative, but that the requirement that we tolerate all of them, that is actually an absolute judgment, not a relative one. So that is the end of this video.